Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be having some fantasy romance book recommendations. So I love fantasy books, and of course I love romance, and when they combine, it's probably like my favorite thing ever in the entire world. So I thought that I would put together just a list of some fantasy romance books that I in particularly really loved. I have a list of 8 books. All of these are books that I have read and that I have rated either 3 to 5 stars, and I think that they are great examples of a really good fantasy romance book. So the first book that I want to talk about today is A Promise of Fire by Amanda Boucher. This book is about Kat, who is disguised as a soothsayer for a circus that's traveling, and Griffin, who is a warlord from a country who has been magic deprived. They don't have any magic in his country. When Griffin sees Kat, he recognizes that she is the kingmaker, or he thinks that she's the kingmaker, and that she has great reservoirs of magical power and could be the key to bringing magic back to his land. So he wants her as a weapon for his realm. This is such a great enemies to lovers romance. It has a lot of travel in it if you like that. He kind of kidnaps her in the beginning, and this book reminds me almost like a Jennifer L. Armentrout kind of bantery back and forth. Like, it's just, their relationship is really a lot of fun to watch develop, as at first she really hates him and he's honestly pretty funny throughout the whole thing, and to watch his feelings for her grow too, so he sees her then more as just something he could use to bring his kingdom back to glory. And this was a really fun read. It was a pretty quick read. This is a series, so there are 3 of these. I've only read the first one, but I really loved it, and I think it was a great fantasy romance. The next book I want to talk about is The Bridge Kingdom by Danielle Jensen. I listened to this on audio, and I believe this is an Audible exclusive. This is a really great audiobook. You can get it on Kindle too, but the audiobook is so good because it has like a full cast narration, or at least it has male and female characters. I listened to this a few years ago, so I can't quite remember if it had a full cast, but I know it had male and female. And the actors do a wonderful job in this book. It was really such a pleasure to listen to. The Bridge Kingdom itself, it controls all trade and travel between all the different lands. So it can make itself more wealthy, or it can like deprive neighboring countries and countries that are enemies. So one of those countries that it's depriving is Princess Laura. And Princess Laura was raised from childhood to be a spy, like a really lethal spy. Her and her sisters were raised and groomed to one day be a bride for King Aaron, who's the ruler of the Bridge Kingdom. So she gets chosen to be his bride, and this was such a fascinating story to see her really battle with that, like wanting to destroy him and bring him down so that her country can have access to the Bridge Kingdom. But she sees that he's very protective of his people and is really a noble and good man, and she starts to fall in love with him. And right from the beginning, he's very tender and kind with her, and really sort of feels bad in the way that she's been forced into marriage with him and wants her to fall in love with him. And it ends with such a cliffhanger. There's a second book out, which I haven't listened to yet, but I definitely plan to. This was completely enjoyable, and I really loved it. It's a great fantasy romance that I honestly don't hear very many people talking about, so definitely look that one up. The next book I want to talk about is Storm and Fury by Jennifer L. Armentrout. So this book is actually a spin-off from one of her previous series, Dark Elements series. This features characters from that series, and you don't really have to read that series first. I think you could read this one on its own, and I feel like this one is a little bit more modern and a little bit more approachable, especially if you're an adult, because this deals with an 18-year-old character. It's shelved as YA, but I would definitely say it's at least new adult. So if you are not a fan of YA books, this definitely doesn't read like a YA, in my opinion. It's more new adult. So this has Trinity, who's 18 years old, and she is actually going blind, and one of her special abilities is that she can see ghosts and spirits and communicate with them. But this is like a secret of her, one of her powers that should be kept secret, and because it will reveal a dangerous truth about her where people would want to get her and kill her. So she's been in hiding, surrounded by wardens, who are like gargoyle shapeshifters, and they are charged with like protecting humans from demons. This book series also gives me huge supernatural vibes, so if you are a fan of supernatural, you might want to check this series out too, because it's super fun that way. So as she's in hiding and being protected by these wardens, a neighboring clan of wardens comes to report to her home that something is out there killing both demons and wardens. And one of the protectors, or one of the wardens from that clan, is Zane, who becomes her love interest, and they set out to kind of reveal the mystery, and it just has a bigger plot than that. But this book, honestly, I felt was fantastic. I really loved it. I think that Jennifer L. Armentrout makes books that are compulsively readable, and I love her dialogue, and I also love her relationships, and there's a lot of heat, and there's a lot of intrigue, and this was just a really super fun read. I thought it was great. You should definitely check it out. And the next book I have to talk about is Rhapsodic by Lara Thalassa. So first of all, I want to say that this was like billed to me as, if you like A Court of Mist and Fury, you would like this too. While I do think it has similar, I don't think it has similar vibes. It has similar elements. This deals with the Fae and the fairy world, much in the same way that A Court of Mist and Fury does, but it really has definitely a different tone. This feels much more like urban fantasy to me than like the high fantasy-ish that A Court of Mist and Fury is. So this story is about Callie, who is a siren, and for the last 7 years she has been collecting a string of black beads on her bracelet, which are IOUs, magical IOUs, that she owes to the Bargainer. The Bargainer is a Fae male, and he makes these bargains with people, and eventually will ask for repayment of the IOUs. So for every bead that you have to repay him back in later years. You either can repay them however he asks you to, or through death. So it's not really a great thing to have those. But for Callie, he has never once asked her to repay him, until he shows up one day with some things that are happening in his kingdom, and he needs her help, and the first favor he asks for her to repay him is a kiss. This was a really good, dark, romantic fantasy. I thought that it was pretty interesting. My favorite part of this was the romantic elements. I felt like the plot was a little bit weak. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I did enjoy it, but it definitely wasn't a 5-star read for me, but just going in for the romantic relationship made it worthwhile. So, and the next book I want to talk about is Girl of Fire and Thorns by Rae Carson. This is an older YA. This is, I believe, the only YA book that I have on my list. The romance in here was so beautiful and so slow burn, and is one of my all-time favorite tropes that I had to recommend it to you. My favorite trope in this is the princess and her guard. I just love it so much. So this story is about Elisa, who is a chosen one to save the kingdoms at this time. And she is sent to be married to a king whose country is in turmoil. The king's guard name is Hector. There is a huge, huge plot. This is a trilogy, goes through 3 books. It's a really unique and beautiful fantasy story, and I don't want to really go into too much detail about that. So I would recommend this if you love a rich, unique fantasy, but you also want a really wonderful romance in there too, because that's what this is. I feel like it has, in each book, varying levels, but almost equal, of romance and fantasy. It was really great. It was also a really fun adventure story, and super readable. Easy to read, quick to get through, a ton of fun. Loved this series. And the next book that I'm going to recommend is also sort of pushed to people who want A Court of Mist and Fury vibes, and that is Fortuna Sworn by KJ Sutton. This book I just read this year for the reading rush, and I really enjoyed it. There were parts of it that I didn't enjoy quite as much as others, but overall I felt like this was really a fun read, and the ending made me desperate to pick up the second book. So this story is about Fortuna, who is a nightmare, and she's the last of her kind, and nightmares are able to know your darkest fears and then turn them against you. And she is looking for her brother, who has just disappeared and has been missing for 2 years. She's just desperate to find him, when she is suddenly approached by the fairy Colith, who offers to tell her where her brother is if she will marry him. This is an indie pub book, and it was really, really interesting. I think that this writer has a lot of promise, and I am really very excited to read the next book because it really left me hanging and I desperately wanted to know more. So this is a great one if you're looking for a fairy adult type of romance. This almost sort of gave me vibes of Dark Artifice's Mortal Instruments series. That type of fairy world, that's what these fairies feel like, way more than A Court of Mist and Fury. It doesn't really feel like that type of fairies to me. It feels more like the darker fairies that you would find maybe even in the Cruel Prince type of world. That type of sort of merciless, tricky fairies. It was super good. And the next book I have is one of my favorites. It was a 5-star read for me. Everyone loves this. Everyone talks about it. This is on everyone's list about fantasy romances. And I'm putting it on mine too. And that is Radiance by Grace Draven. This book was so beautiful and just so heartwarming, and so the romance was so soft and lovely. It was just so perfect. I loved it so much. So this book is about Prince Brishan of the Kai. They are like humans, but not like they have gray skin, and I think they have fangs, and they don't eat the same type of foods that humans do. And Ildiko, who is the niece of the Gower King. And there's this tension and upheaval between their two countries, and they enter into a political alliance for both of their countries, but it requires a marriage between their people to seal the treaty. This is one of the few fantasy romance books that I've read where it's a friends to lovers and they like each other from the beginning, and it's really just so beautiful to see their relationship evolve. I would definitely say that there is a little bit of more of a fantasy plot towards the end that kind of leaves you wondering like what's going to happen between their kingdoms and reveals a bigger plot that will probably continue in future books. But the majority of this is really just about the romance between the two of them and trying to overcome their differences in their different races, and they fall in love, and it was beautiful and just perfect and so sweet. And if you haven't read this, you must read it. If you pick one book that you haven't read on my list, please read this one because it was perfect. 5 stars. Loved it. And the last book I have to talk about is a little bit unique in that this is definitely not a happily ever after romance. The story between these two characters was so completely compelling that I just had to include it. And that is Deathless by Catherine Valente. So if you have heard of this book, you've probably heard that it's a little bit weird and that people have a hard time explaining what it's about. And I would say that that is kind of true. This is very almost allegorical and a little bit symbolic, but it's just also just a really beautiful book. It's very, very powerful. There are so many one-line passages in this book that I highlighted and that I just love and look at all the time. Like as soon as I finished this book, I went to look up fan art, and I suggest you do that so you can get a feel for the book because it's really just a dark, aesthetic, haunting vibe. It definitely ends a little bit tragically, so I hope that doesn't sway you from not reading this, because if you're ever in the mood for a strange, lyrically, literary fiction romance, please pick this up because it is unique and I have not ever read anything like it. It left me thinking about it for months after, and I still think about it often. So let me finally tell you what it's about. So this book is about Koshchei the Deathless, who is to Russian folklore what like demons and witches are to European literature, like a fairy tale. He's the villain of countless stories, and he is pretty much the bad guy. Maria Morevna is the female who he chooses to be his bride. She grows from being a child of the Russian Revolution to his beautiful bride throughout the story of this book. It's the thing that I really, really liked about this book is that you don't just see one instance of them meeting and marrying and then happily ever after. You see a lot of sides of reality in a relationship that maybe isn't great reading, that leaves you feeling happy, but is also relatable. This book was just super compelling, unputdownable, a short read, strange, beautiful, just super interesting. I really loved it. Okay, those are the books that I recommend if you're looking for a fantasy romance book to read. Let me know if you've read any of these or if you plan to pick one up and what you think about it. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.